Many gamers have never heard of Terranigma, and those who have may know little about it aside from the fact it never made it stateside, despite it being localized for English-speaking countries. For those of us who have played it and beat it, we realize how this is one of the true tragedies of the 1990s. Granted, growing up in the 90s with the Super Nintendo pretty much guarantees you had a good childhood. You got to enjoy amazing titles like Super Metroid, Turtles in Time, Yoshi's Island, Final Fantasy VI, Mega Man X, Chrono Trigger, and Chrono Trigger. Terranigma has stellar visuals, a beyond epic journey, and an amazing soundtrack. If you grew up in the 90s and love playing Super Nintendo, Terranigma is a hidden gem you never got to play, and is every bit worthy of sitting beside the console's strongest titles, and this is exactly why you should play Terranigma. Terranigma is what you could call an early single-player action RPG, a game that has a control style and battle system not too far from Zelda titles, although instead of having hearts, you have health points. Instead of counting the amount of attacks done to an enemy to determine its HP and the strength of your attack, you see the damage you do represented by numbers. Obviously, there were games in this genre years before Terranigma, one example being Crystallis for the NES. However, in that game you see no numbers regarding damage dealt or damage received. You also had a life bar, a design choice that was super common with the times. It seemed to be a general consensus back in the day that if a game had flowing stat-based action like Zelda, then it wouldn't use numbers to address the player of how the battle is going. They used life bars or hearts. Apparently, life bars were so popular here in the US that they even threw one in Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, an RPG tailored to what Squaresoft believed US audiences wanted. However, Terranigma was among the first games to break away from that trope entirely. Like most RPGs, in Terranigma, you can fully view your character's stats, but despite that, the game honestly isn't very deep. When you see a new weapon or armor, equip it right away. An enemy too tough? Just grind a bit, it won't be. Even with its more simple RPG mechanics, I'm glad it exists, because it's games like these that eventually paved the way for games like these. Terranigma's story, for not being terribly complex, still manages to be wildly imaginative and fascinating. The adventure you go on is honestly nothing short of epic, and a big reason this game has the cult following it does. Terranigma I see as a stepping stone of sorts for modern games today, and what a beautiful stepping stone it is. You play as Ark in Terranigma, a young man presumably in his teens, who starts off as something of a troublemaker. Something interesting about him, however, is he's actually a speaking character. Now, having main characters speak wasn't unheard of by this time. Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 were already out, and there's no silent protagonist in any of these games. However, amongst adventure games that had a single main character, this was something not terribly common. You see his joy, sadness, and sometimes amazement by the events taking place around him, and I love this approach. Because Ark speaks, it allows him to better interact with his supporting cast, and lets his supporting cast better interact with him. What do I mean? Well, let me ask you, when's the last time you saw a side character get mad at this guy? Almost never. While there inherently is nothing wrong with that, it does have its limitations. I need to bring up a couple other games to explain this. These aren't huge spoilers, but they are spoilers, so be warned. Let's take Final Fantasy IX and the PlayStation/DS version of Chrono Trigger for example. Which ending relationship feels more genuine? Zidane and Garnet, or Chrono and Marle? Chrono and Marle just suddenly getting married feels very out of nowhere to me. It's as if Cloud just got with Yuffie in the end of 7 because he kept her in the party. And unlike what you see in Final Fantasy IX between these two, you don't see any real character building between them. Something that alludes to this ending scene feeling more genuine. Sure, if you smash the Epoch into Lavos you can get this scene first, but say you didn't. Because Chrono is silent, there's no real bonding dialogue that can happen between the two of them. So, when you see them suddenly getting married in the end, these events alone doesn't really give enough build up for me. But that's kind of it. When you have a silent protagonist, and no real dialogue choices to drive the subject home, I think it comes off as jarring. I see that to be a nasty side effect of having a silent protagonist. Now Terranigma, for the most part, takes the wheel out of your hands and gives it to a preconceived character. In doing so, things happen. Maybe this guy isn't always Mr. Perfect all the time. Maybe this guy has his dark spots. Maybe this guy can only put up with so much crap from others, thus allowing for arguments to take place and be realistically solved, because it wasn't something the writers had to plan for both outcomes. Whereas, in the end, we only get a watered down experience, something more recent games can even suffer from. They can now go through real conflicts of interest, resentment, then understanding, and further bonding. I feel this is an important aspect of storytelling to respect, because when it goes ignored, it can come off as inharmonious. Now that is not to bash every silent protagonist. I love Chrono and Link, and this style of character certainly has its place. But isn't it much better to have this kind of character as well? Games like Terranigma help change the trend for the better. The combat in Terranigma is very satisfying and fluent. What makes it feel so great is just how much control you have over your character arc. For one thing, his movement isn't very generic feeling, and it feels like he has some weight to him as he moves around, and it's done in such a way that doesn't feel annoying or out of place. Arc can also jump, which isn't very common for the genre. His momentum on the ground determines the distance of his jump, which admittedly isn't unheard of by this time either, but it's nice to see a developer find a way to work this into a genre that typically doesn't have it at all, and to be able to work it in very well. Aside from just having a basic attack, he has quite a stash of them, and while several of the enemies you can just plow through going full force, many of them have certain ways they need to be engaged, and if you try to rush straight through them, it can get you killed, making you respect the game's required tactics. There's a magic system in the game, but if you're like me, you'll barely use it, since it isn't really readily available unless you invest all this time finding these magic rocks to buy the spells, and yeah, it looks cool and can be helpful time to time, but the majority of the game, you'll either skip it or forget it's even available. Throughout the course of the game, you'll also pick up items that make you able to traverse the world better, close to how it is in Zelda, although it's not a guarantee you pick up something for every single dungeon, and that's fine. New gadgets isn't the focus of the gameplay, but it does a good job making exploration more fun in new areas. Now, the game is an action RPG, so to discuss the RPG side of it is to basically say you level up. That's honestly about it. You fight and get stronger. You can explore the world in the game and find better loot, and that is exciting, yes. But as for tactics with what you equip on character, there isn't anything to mention. Put on your strongest gear, make sure you have enough bulbs, and you're good to go. Now that may sound kind of negative, but this was before the times of Diablo, where gear combinations in an action RPG was so critical, and it was likely believed that trying to tie in the two would be too much burden on the player, especially for a game that's played at this pace. And honestly, there's never anything wrong with a game having simple mechanics, so long as it works. And even today, if you tried this game for the first time, you may be surprised at just how good it feels. And that's worth mentioning, because not every game has a control style or game mechanics that age very well over time. If there's one thing about this game that'll keep you coming back for more, it could very likely be the gameplay. Another thing I love about this game are its graphics. Terranigma is a game in which the graphics really aged amazingly over time. Now that's typically true with Super Nintendo games over Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 titles. 2D sprite-based games are something still highly admired, and when a new one comes out today, people can really take notice, especially when you see just how impressive one can look. You'll notice quickly in Terranigma just how great Arc's animations are. All his movements have a great fluid feel to them. There's a good reason for that actually. Early in the development for Terranigma, it was decided that the character, Arc, would be the only one the player controls, and because of this, it freed up memory limitations without having several other playable characters. This allowed for Arc to have all the various detailed movement, a feature unobtainable in the previous two titles. It was also believed that having Arc as the sole character you controlled made it easier for players to connect with him. All that being said, the great visuals hardly stop at Arc alone. Within the first hour of the game, you will take in plenty of sprite work that really stands out. Rays of light shining through the window, a group of weavers sewing in unison, and a kettle bubbling over a hot stove. The list goes on. That's not even to mention the amazing cinematic-like scenes they were able to accomplish too, nor the environments, which are quite a spectacle to see. One can feel quite lush and beautiful, and another one dry and ghastly. The great visual direction comes from the inspirations of the director himself, Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, the original writer for the first 3 entries of the Yi series on the Famicom. Miyazaki said that in his process of game development that he often drew inspiration from what you would find in travel guides. Traveling in games are the same, in that you set out somewhere with a purpose or goal. For instance, you journey to Nara to see the Great Buddha, but just going there and seeing the Buddha isn't really what makes travel fun, is it? It's the unexpected things you find along the way that make it worthwhile. I think it's the same with games. Those special episodes that happen when you travel are published in people's travel accounts. When I'm writing a scenario for a game, I often use them. As you play the game, you can really see what he's talking about. The game's story is where the world you explore has already been destroyed. Admittedly, that sounds pretty cliche. You see something similar in the intro of both Secret of Mana and Final Fantasy VI. Although neither of these games make you feel the weight of that history like this game does. And it's the way it presents this reality that makes the journey feel so epic. Think of Dragon Quest, where it's fun to fight battles and get stronger. With Soul Blazer, you've got the progression of building the world as you seal enemy nests. For people who are bad at action games, fighting enemies itself might not be much fun, but defeating enemies here is closely connected with building of the world. Miyazaki may state it plainly as an alternate way of obtaining satisfaction compared to the kind you would get when grinding in an RPG, but when you see the amazing impact your actions have, it's honestly mind-blowing. I dare say not since this game has there been anything made where the protagonist accomplishes something as heavy as this. And it's the way the game presents these feats as you complete them I find to be so incredibly immersive. The music was led by both Miyoko Kobayashi and Masanori Hikichi. I sadly can find very little information or interviews on either of them that really describe the process in making the soundtrack for this game, but thankfully, the music is so good it really speaks for itself. You'll find much of the same charm to the soundtrack as you would get from Chrono Trigger's, themes that hit on very prideful highs and sorrowful lows, music that speaks to feelings of immense courage, puzzling mystery, and childlike innocence. Whilst capturing the emotions the player feels, it also has pieces that help immerse you by the region your character is in. The game takes place on Earth, and the music does a great job reflecting that. In the game's strongest moments that pull at your emotions, you hear the use of leitmotif in the music to drive home just how epic of an adventure you have partaken. Terranigma's soundtrack is beautiful, and saying it'll give you goosebumps is a major understatement. Terranigma was created by Quintet, a studio in Kuokara, Japan, which was responsible for titles like ActRaiser 1 and 2, Soul Blazer, Robotrek, and Illusion of Gaia. Now, Terranigma isn't a one-off for the series for the company either. This is actually the third installment in the Soul Blazer series, the prior two seeing North American releases, so you may be wondering, if all these games were released in North America, why hasn't Terranigma? Well, that's a little side story that has less to do with Quintet and more to do with their publisher Enix, or in this case, Enix America Corporation. Enix America Corporation was a subsidiary responsible for bringing over Quintet's games as well as the Dragon Warrior titles to the US, but unfortunately, unlike what was happening in Japan, Enix never had a great selling game in North America. In fact, the sales of Dragon Warrior 3 in Japan surpasses the sales for every single Dragon Warrior game ever made that was released in the US, and yes, that's including the more recent titles too. The same holds true for Quintet's games. So in 1995, they closed the door to Enix America Corporation, thusly closing the doors to Terranigma's arrival in the US. Now, as sad as that is, there is some good to come of it. Terranigma, in many ways, is a dark game that has several mature themes within. I feel pretty safe to say that much of what makes Terranigma rich with its darker themes are materials that would have been cut. But that's not to say they would ruin the game if they did. Terranigma would still be wildly fun to play, amazing to see and explore, and breathtaking to hear. And that's what makes me so pissed it never came to us in the 90s. A game that focuses on the rebirth of the world once destroyed, Terranigma manages to bring up some themes that are prevalent in any period of history. Mankind's willingness to tamper with the unknown, what it's like to appreciate the life we have, and what it's like to come to terms with our own death. Terranigma will leave you feeling isolated when it's barren, euphoric when it's beautiful, morose when it's grim, and overall enlightened through its journey. And that is exactly why you should play Terranigma.